It's kind of crazy when you think about it. For thousands of years, we've built empires, we've crossed oceans, we've fought massive wars, all for a shiny yellow rock. It doesn't feed you, it doesn't keep you warm, but somehow it has shaped pretty much everything about our world. So what is the big deal with this one particular metal?
I mean, seriously, why? How has this one element held such an iron grip on our imaginations and on our economies for 5,000 years? That is the big question we're going to dig into right now.
So to get to the bottom of gold's power, we've got to ask an even more basic question first. What makes anything work as money? Like, what makes money, money? Turns out there's a very specific checklist, and well, gold just happens to be the perfect student. And it's wild. Gold basically nails every single one of these. It's rare, you can't just whip up a new batch, it is unbelievably durable. I mean, gold pulled from a Roman shipwreck that's been underwater for 2,000 years. Looks brand new. It's instantly recognizable, you can chop it up into tiny pieces, it's easy to carry around, and come on, let's be honest, we just like shiny things.
In that first point, rarity, it is so important. For centuries, you had all these alchemists desperately trying to turn cheap metals like lead into gold. And you know what? We should all be so glad they failed. Imagine if they'd pulled it off. Gold would have become worthless, like overnight. The very fact that you can't just make it is exactly what gives it its value.
Okay, so because of these unique qualities, gold wasn't just going to sit around being a pretty rock. Early civilizations took it from being a beautiful metal to a symbol of the gods, and eventually to the very foundation of how we buy and sell things. And this whole story kicks off way, way back.
So yeah, here's the quick and dirty roadmap. We're about to see gold go on this incredible journey from being like the literal property of gods and pharaohs to the stuff Roman soldiers got paid with, and then the ultimate prize that drove the conquest of entire continents.
The Egyptians, their obsession was just on a whole other level. They literally believed gold was the divine flesh of the sun god Ra. It's hard to even wrap your head around their devotion. When they found King Tut's tomb, his inner coffin alone was made of 110 kilograms. That's nearly 250 pounds of pure, solid gold. For one teenager?
For a long time, if you wanted to buy something with gold, it was a real pain. You had to lug around a scale, weigh out little bits of dust. It was just messy. Then, around 600 BC, these guys, the Lydians, have this genius idea. Hey, what if we make standard-sized pieces and just stamp them with the king's seal to guarantee what they're worth? And boom, the coin was born. This was a total game changer for trade.
All right, so the Romans, they loved their gold coins, but they hit a snag. The empire got so big they couldn't find enough new gold to pay their giant army. So what do? Well, the emperors got tricky. First, they just made the coins a little smaller. Then they started mixing in cheaper metals. That process is called debasement, and it was basically the OG version of inflation, a lesson we'd see repeated for centuries.
Okay, let's jump forward more than 1,000 years. Now, another empire's lust for gold leads to this incredible and tragic collision of worldviews. When the Spanish conquistadors show up in the Americas, they find cultures like the Aztecs who also loved gold, but they saw it in a completely different way. For the Aztecs, it was a sacred art form, telling the stories of their ancestors. For the Spanish, it was just stuff, raw material to be melted into bars and shipped back to the king.
All this gold flooding the world eventually leads to people trying to create some order out of the chaos. For about 100 years, the world's biggest economies came up with a pretty big idea. Let's officially tie the value of our paper money directly to a specific amount of physical gold.
And that's what we call the gold standard. The whole point was to create stability, right? A government couldn't just go wild with the printing press whenever it felt like it. If you had a dollar bill, you could actually go to a bank and swap it for a tiny piece of gold. It was like a leash on government spending.
But yeah, a system like that is really hard to maintain when things go wrong. And boy, did things go wrong. World War I forced countries to print money like crazy to pay for the war, breaking the rules. Then the Great Depression hit, and that golden leash stopped governments from being able to help their economies. It got so serious that the US actually made it illegal for its own citizens to own gold. The whole thing was basically on life support.
And then came the final nail in the coffin. See, after World War II, the US dollar was the king, and it was still technically backed by gold. But America had printed way more dollars than it had gold. So on a random Sunday night in 1971, President Nixon gets on TV and just cuts the cord. The last connection between our money and gold was gone. Just like that. The gold window was slammed shut for good.
So, Nixon's little announcement? It completely changed the game, throwing the world into a totally new era. For the first time ever, all the world's money was fiat currency. That's just a fancy way of saying it's backed by nothing but a government's promise. And the results were? Well, pretty immediate and kinda shocking.
Check this out. The second gold was set free from the dollar. Its price just went ballistic. It went from that fixed price of $35 an ounce in '71 to $850 an ounce less than a decade later. That is a gain of over 2,000%. It was like the free market was screaming what it thought gold was actually worth all along.
And without that golden leash, governments were now free to print money on a scale that was once unimaginable. I mean, just look at this number. $6 trillion. That's how much new money the U.S. created in just a 2-year span after 2020. You just couldn't do that under a gold standard. No way. It would have been impossible.
But this is where it gets really interesting. This is the paradox, right? The very same groups printing all this money, the central banks, what are they doing on the side? They're quietly buying up tons and tons of physical gold. China, Russia, India, they're all stacking it. Even the U.S. still holds over 8,000 tons. So you have to ask yourself, what do they know that we don't?
Well, maybe they just know their history. Because if you look back, history tells us one thing very clearly. Empires rise, and they fall. Rome fell and its coins became worthless junk. The Spanish Empire faded. The British pound is no longer the king. But through every single one of those collapses, the one thing that survived was gold. And that really brings us full circle to this killer quote from the banker J.P. Morgan, way back in 1912. He said, "Gold is money. Everything else is credit." He was basically saying that only gold is real, tangible value. Everything else, every dollar, euro, or yen in your pocket, it's just a promise, an IOU from a government. Which leaves us with a huge question for our time, right? In a world of trillions of digital dollars flying around, is this ancient shiny rock still the ultimate measure of what's real?